I do believe that despite the slow growth in Western economies, globalization is actually entering something of a golden age. And the reason is because of emerging markets and frontier markets. All continents, all regions of the world are finally included in this globalization process through trade, commerce, supply chains, and so forth. Latin America and Africa are now part of the globalization picture in ways they had not been in centuries past. So I think that's extremely important, that we not think about globalization as simply being derivative of whether or not the United States or Great Britain or Western Europe is for trade and for globalization, but rather look at the relationships that are deepening constantly between Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The geopolitical landscape of the world has been radically altered in the last 20 years. At the end of the Cold War, it was a unipolar moment for the United States, and there were only second-tier powers that had to revolve their relationships around the US. Today, we are in what I call a geopolitical marketplace, in which there are multiple superpowers and great powers across all continents. Every region is important, and everyone is forming bilateral, multilateral, interregional alliances and economic relationships with everyone else. So there are so many examples of that happening in terms of the rise of trade corridors, for example, between China and the Middle East and Africa and Latin America. We're seeing this in strategic relationships. We're seeing alliances being built and declared between China and India and Saudi Arabia and Brazil and Russia. So this is truly an open marketplace in which countries don't simply choose to align with the US or against the US. They practice what I call multi-alignment. They form alliances that are sometimes economic, sometimes political, sometimes developmental, with different players at the same time. I think the debate about coupling versus decoupling in the global economy has really shifted in favor of those who recognized and who advocated the decoupling position a decade ago. We can clearly see that despite the sustained low growth in OECD economies, there is a tremendous amount of growth in cross-emerging market trade. We used to call this South-South trade. In 2005, that was only $50 billion. Today, $50 billion is one two-day trip by a Chinese official with a plane full of business executives in Africa. That's just one day of a South-South relationship today. So that volume of trade is growing drastically. And it shows that emerging markets trading with each other are diversifying, and that's creating more resilience for them, more options, more strategies, and that ultimately reinforces the notion that there can be some decoupling. When it comes to looking at how emerging markets are spending the investment revenues that they have and the surpluses that they've earned in recent years, to me, the single factor that stands out the most in determining whether or not they'll be able to convert that into long-term growth is infrastructure. When you see emerging markets spending 8 to 10% of their budgets and of the total GDP being allocated to infrastructure, I believe that is a strong predictor that a decade later even, they'll be growing at very high rates. And we see that happening in some of the key Asian economies today, like China, like Malaysia, like Vietnam, and increasingly Indonesia as well. And India is starting to catch up, but it still lags behind quite a bit. So there's a very strong correlation, though, between strong infrastructure commitment and long-term growth. And this is obvious in some ways, because these are countries that have very large populations whose infrastructure has been neglected since the colonial era, really 2 or 3 generations ago. So by investing in infrastructure, they're creating jobs, and they're connecting the society and creating the foundations for a service and consumer-driven society in the years ahead. Well, the relationship between democracy and globalization is interesting. We used to believe that by necessity, the westernization trend that globalization carried with it would mean that there would be automatic democratization around the world. But in fact, what is the case is that democracy requires capitalism, but capitalism does not require democracy. So we have quite a few authoritarian capitalist states, China, of course, being foremost among them. And we have these paternalistic, monarchic models of the Middle East, Persian Gulf, There's a Russian sort of model in there as well. So there's quite a few ways to go about state-driven or financed, not democratically driven, but high-growth economic model that's very capitalist in nature. So clearly we're seeing this sort of cleavage again between politics and economics, because there is a premium on growth, even in societies where there is a desire for more democracy. And between the two, interestingly enough, many people, many societies are choosing that they want to focus on the growth. There are many societies, particularly the Philippines and Thailand and India, right? Democratic societies where constant corruption, political volatility, uncertainty about the future, lack of long-term policy commitments to infrastructure and other areas really do hamper growth. So that's why we're seeing a drastic revision of the economic forecast for India, for example, downward, unfortunately. So when it comes to Asia, and we look at the role model states or economies, they are not the Philippines and Thailand and India and Indonesia. They're much more Malaysia and Vietnam and China and Singapore. And those tend to be the ones which have somewhat more managed economic governance. I believe we need a new lens to interpret global change in the 21st century. The prevailing model of the last century has been geopolitics, the idea of the balance of power, particularly military power among key nations. In the late 20th century, some people started to speak about geoeconomics, focusing on the terms of trade, balance of payments, currency reserves, capital stock, outward FDI, and these other kinds of levers of influence. And it's very valid and important on top of the geopolitical factors. But I believe those two alone still don't explain sufficiently the real dynamics of power today. I think we need a third lens or a third corner of a triangle, and I call that geotechnology. I think we need to analyze the leading technological clusters of the 21st century and look at where investment and innovation is happening to then determine who is going to commercialize and build up the economic advantages the fastest and the most robustly, and then determine who is going to convert that into strategic or geopolitical leverage. So I think that to understand the emerging map of power in the world, you have to look at information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, alternative energy, advanced manufacturing, robotics, and artificial intelligence, and these 7 or 8 and more technological clusters. And that is going to tell us a lot about the future. So geotechnology, I believe, is a more useful paradigm than geopolitics or geoeconomics. I think that because of the rise of emerging markets, we need to have a new understanding of these traditional categories of East and West. There's been a cliche belief that the rise of the East, because it's so populous and strong, is going to displace the West, and the Pacific Ocean would really replace the Atlantic Ocean as the center of gravity, and China would replace America as the world's leading superpower. I don't think that's true. I think East and West will be powerful at the same time. The East doesn't have a common cultural heritage. The East can include everything from the Middle East and Arab societies to China and India. So there's very little cultural commonality. The West has much more in common. And the West really has 3 pillars to me. It's not just Western Europe and North America. It's all of the European Union, 500+ million people. And it's North America. And it's also South America or Latin America. Latin America has less than 1 billion people, but the same GDP as China. So it is a very important force in the world economy and geopolitically. And it is part of the West. Latin America is undeniably a pillar of the West. And what we'll see in the coming decades is that the Western Hemisphere will start to have increasing energy, autarky, and independence from the rest of the world. And that the peaceful relations that Europe, North America, and South America enjoy will stand in stark contrast to Asia and the East, where there's a lot of rivalry and tension. So I do believe that the West is not to be counted out. The West will remain a true anchor of world stability in the 21st century as well.